In this video, I'm testing and comparing the viral HY300 Pro small cheap $30 projector alongside a $70 projector, an OLED TV, to answer one simple question. Are these cheap viral projectors bad? So if you use TikTok, Temu, or just the internet in general, you've likely seen one of these cheap clones of the Samsung Freestyle projector. And whilst the Samsung costs well over £400, I picked this one up from Aliexpress for £21. I can only assume these are so popular because of the small form factor and the very low price. I will caveat this by saying I'm reviewing this based on its price. This is in no way going to come close to AV enthusiast level projectors or gear, so just bear that in mind. So this projector has a built-in stand, which also has a grippy base and a tripod screw mount, which means you can attach it to either a tripod or a lighting stand to be able to mount and project onto your wall. It also features a HDMI input, a 3.5mm audio output, a USB port. It has a manual focusing mechanism to focus the projection, and it also comes included with a very clicky remote that allows you to control all the features. For £21, surprisingly, this has a built-in Android operating system, which comes pre-installed with Netflix and YouTube. It has its own app store, which allows you to install other apps like Disney+, Kodi, Amazon Prime Video, and it also has the Google Play Store, which has a few extra apps like Apple TV or DAZN or other sports apps like that. However, this isn't the only option for watching things through the projector. You can obviously plug things in using the HDMI port, so a Fire TV stick if you've got one, or a laptop through an HDMI port. It also has a calculator app built in case you want to use a calculator in the worst way imaginable. So how does the Android operating system on this perform? Honestly, it's not that bad. In fact, it's actually a little bit snappier than my Philips Android TV, although it's nowhere near as quick as things like my Apple TV or my LG OLED TV. Another option for playback, I mentioned the USB port on the back, and that is so you can plug in your own USB stick with your own files, movies, or videos. Alternatively, you can wirelessly cast to the device using your Android or iOS device. Now, the more expensive projector does this a little bit better. However, the more expensive projector doesn't have a built-in Android operating system, so that's one of the only ways it can project and get content onto the projector. And to be honest, on both projectors, the Apple Airplay works fine, and I didn't have a problem with either. Although weirdly, the more expensive projector projects a smaller image when you use the Airplay. So when you get them lined up next to each other, they look the right size, and then the moment you go into Airplay on both, you'll notice that the more expensive projector has a smaller image, which is a bit frustrating if you'd already set up your screen. Now, both of these projectors are relatively short throw projectors, which means you can get quite a large image from quite close up. So this is about a meter away from the wall to the front of the projector, and it's currently projecting an image that matches my 48-inch OLED TV. Speaking of image quality, that's one of the main things I'm sure you want to know about both of these projectors, especially the cheap one. Now, both are advertised as 720p native resolution images, so that just means that they are an actual 720p image that's being projected. Just beware when you're looking for these projectors, you'll often find they are advertised at 1080p or even 4K, and a lot of the time that doesn't mean that's what they're projecting at. That just means they can accept that level of signal and then project it out using the image on it, which is usually a 720p image. And as we're talking about the image, these all work in a very similar way, these cheap projectors, where they have a small LCD screen inside and a very bright LED light behind them, and that projects through the LCD screen. And because you lose a lot of that light in the projection, you'll often find a lot of these cheap projectors are quite dark. And as you can see between the two of them, the more expensive one is quite clearly a bit brighter than the cheaper one. However, saying that, I found that the cheaper one had a much more balanced image. You could see more in the shadows and the highlights weren't as blown out. So although the more expensive one had a brighter, more poppier image, this one probably has the better balance contrast-wise. So to get a good contrast ratio using these projectors, or any projectors, a lot of the time you want to block out as much light as possible. So ideally, ideal conditions would be at night, or if not, and how I've done it here is I've blocked out a lot of the light using curtains and shutting all doors. So as you can see, there's some ambient light in the room, but it allows us to block out most of that light to get a better contrast ratio. To improve brightness, you can of course just move the projector closer to the wall. That will reduce the size of your image, but increase the perceived brightness. And obviously that's just the sort of trade-off you get. You get a smaller image, but a brighter image. That's physics. Both projectors, including the cheap one, have auto Keystone, which was quite surprising. Although do bear in mind, auto Keystone is digitally altering the image to sort of rebalance and make it square. So what it's doing there is reducing the quality overall. Although to be honest, if you're worried about quality, you're probably not too concerned buying a projector that's £21. And speaking of the image quality, let's touch on the lenses used in these. As you might have been able to tell from the comparisons, the more expensive projector certainly has a better lens because you can see from the edges they are much sharper, whereas the cheaper projector has a much bigger fall off in sharpness and in brightness around the edges of the frame. And in fact, I couldn't get either projector to be focused completely across the frame. It was always slightly out of focus in one corner compared to the other, even if I adjusted the lens and adjusted the focus and moved the projector where it was. I think the only other way of fixing this would be to take it apart and see if the lens is correctly seated. One nice thing about the more expensive projector is it has a motorized focus, so instead of adjusting it and going and checking and coming back, you can just adjust it close up to the wall, close up to where you're projecting your screen, and it's a little bit easier to get in focus. Speaker quality, yes, they both have built-in speakers. Do not use them.
Something like this, which is a mains powered blower. This was around £40 3 years ago.
Because you won't be able to hear them over the fan anyway. In fact, the best option is to either plug something into the 3.5mm jack auxiliary output, so a speaker or headphones, or in fact you can use Bluetooth speakers with both of these. I found the delay perfectly fine if you were using it through the Android operating system on the cheap model or through the HDMI on the more expensive projector. However, if you're using a casting device, so if you're Airplaying from your phone, for example, there is a significant delay in the audio, so you probably won't want to use a Bluetooth speaker and cast as well to these projectors. Here's an example of the fan noise from both. For either of these projectors, if you're wanting to use your own Fire TV stick, bear in mind a lot of the time you'll need to use the included power adapter for the Fire TV because I don't think the USB ports on these are going to provide enough power to most new Fire TV sticks. One plus about the more expensive projector is it comes with a longer cable. It's around 2 meters, which in this case does reach all the way to the floor with the projector up this high compared to the 1 meter cable which you get with the cheaper projector. However, these are standard figure of 8 IEC 7 cables, so you could just buy yourself a longer one for a few quid. One pretty critical thing to note is both projectors work from behind or from in front using the remote. So a lot of the time some of these projectors don't work from the front, which is a problem if the projector is behind you and you're trying to adjust or change settings. So to conclude, neither projector particularly impressed me with their image quality. I found that the very cheap lenses in them didn't focus across the frame consistently, especially around the edges. The more expensive projector was slightly better in this regard and slightly brighter also. However, for the mighty price of $30 or £21, I can see how this might be a fun little gadget, especially for a kid's room or something like that. I do wish I'd have gone a little bit more expensive with this projector and maybe got a 1080p model instead just to compare to this cheap projector, because relatively speaking they're fairly similar. This just has a slightly brighter, slightly more poppier image, and to be honest I really wanted to try out a 1080p cheap native projector to see how it compared to something like this. And in fact, for most people this is probably the better buy because it's much cheaper and it's actually a lot more user-friendly having Android built in, and you can just go ahead and start watching things straight away on apps. So for a geek like me, I probably won't use this. However, for the average person who's maybe just a bit curious and wants to have something to cheaply project a movie or a TV show sometime for fun, maybe, am I gonna recommend this? Maybe. It's I mean, for £21, you could do a lot worse, and it certainly would make a pretty neat gift for a kid. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and all that good stuff. See you in the next one.